I am Melissa Giblin, Director of North Carolina Center for the Book at North Carolina Humanities. It is my pleasure to be speaking to you this evening from Charlotte, North Carolina. Welcome to this evening's virtual book event. Joining me from our staff is Caitlin Patton Stanley, who will be assisting with this event. Thank you for joining us at the third virtual event in a series for North Carolina Reads, our statewide book club for 2022. North Carolina Reads features 5 books that explore issues of racial, social, and gender equality in the history and culture of North Carolina. As a statewide nonprofit and affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, our mission is to connect North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. This evening features a moderated panel discussion on Even As We Breathe, the third book in our North Carolina Read series. Please note any views, findings, conclusions, opinions, or recommendations expressed by our partners and participants do not necessarily represent those of NC Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is our pleasure to welcome Lorna Ricotta as this evening's moderator. Lorna is North Carolina Humanities Board Chair through 2023 and a member of the Lumbee Tribe. We would also like to welcome Annette Sonnet-Clapsaddle, author of Even As We Breathe, and Dr. Trey Adcock, Professor and Director of American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the University of North Carolina in Asheville, as this evening's panelists. Before we begin, we will briefly discuss a few housekeeping points for this evening's event and practice how to engage with us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available after the live session. We'd love to hear from you during today's event. If you have a question, please send it through the Q&A tab or through the chat box. Closed caption is available by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to share your experience on social media by tagging @NCHumanities. It is my pleasure to turn the event over to Lorna Ricotta to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Melissa, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening's event. I am excited to get to know our featured guest even more, and so I'd like to share more about Annette Sonnet-Clapsaddle. She is a citizen of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and the author of the award-winning novel, Even As We Breathe. She currently resides in Qualla, North Carolina, and teaches English and Cherokee Studies at Swain County High School. Also joining us is Dr. Trey Adcock. He is Associate Professor of the Interdisciplinary Studies and the Director of American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. He currently serves as the Executive Director of the Center for Native Health and sits on the editorial board for the Journal of Cherokee Studies. So welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
We're excited to dig a little deeper into your book and hear more about your thought process. And so I'd like to start with you, Annette, and asking you the first question. What inspired you, first of all, to write a story about a young Cherokee man and his experiences during World War II era specifically?
Yeah, thank you, Lorna and Trey. I'm happy to be here with you, and I just want to thank the NC Humanities for the opportunity. So to your question, this is the first time I think for me that I started writing a manuscript that was setting driven. And so while obviously the novel focuses on the protagonist, County, who is a young Cherokee man from Cherokee, North Carolina, and goes to Asheville to work the summer of 1942. The setting, the backdrop of World War II, specifically at the Grove Park Inn, was really intriguing to me. The Grove Park Inn, the summer of 1942, held Axis diplomats and foreign nationals as prisoners of war. That part is true. But it's a piece of our history that I knew nothing about until a few years ago when I started writing the novel. I had seen an excerpt from the Asheville Citizen-Times newspaper. And I was intrigued that I had never heard the history because I've grown up in the area. I'm married to a historian, I have a lot of historian friends. But also it triggered for me a few points that I think are significant about Native culture. One is that Native Americans have served in the U.S. military at higher rates than any other subgroup in the United States, even prior to us being citizens of the United States or of the states from which we come. And the other point was a kind of a memory from my college days of studying Native history, that some Japanese internment camps were set up on Indian reservations out west. So when I heard about this real history at the Grove Park Inn in Asheville and thought about its proximity to this sovereign nation of the Eastern Band of Cherokee, I really feel like the setting drove me to the story itself. It provided an opportunity, and I know that we're going to talk more about this, to really examine race and class and citizenship within the United States. And I, in particular, was drawn to this young Cherokee man, County, as the protagonist, because I wanted my character to be open to exploring life outside of the Qualla boundary, being curious about where his future could lead, but also being a little nervous about that, right? This brand new experience, and to show how close in proximity in geography we are to Asheville, but how these are very different worlds. And I am a high school English teacher, so I'm around teenage young men and kind of know their trepidation about going into the world. So I felt like I had some inspiration in the character of County.
It's fascinating to hear your insights and your inspiration. So, Trey, I'd like to ask you, can you explain in a larger historical context for the Eastern Band of Cherokee and indigenous communities during the World War II era, your feedback on that time period, and from a larger historical context, what that time period meant layered over the story?
Sure. I mean, that's a big question, and so I'm happy to tackle it as best I can. There are some good resources out there for people that are interested. I think John Finger, who was at University of Tennessee for a really long time, he wrote Cherokee Americans, the EBCI in the 20th Century. That's a really good source, particularly for this conversation. There's also another book, Up from These Hills, which is like autobiographical by Leonard Carson Lambert. And he grew up, he was an Eastern Band member. His son is an Eastern Band member who teaches over at UNC Chapel Hill. And it's about his experience. And they went to Tennessee. And so I think there's a lot of commonalities and story sharing that could happen. I, like Annette, I just want to say really quickly, I do want to acknowledge all of the veterans, because Annette is exactly right. And, per capita, the highest rate of military service out of most, if not all, groups in the United States, even prior to citizenship. And there were also, in World War II, Cherokee code talkers. So there's just a lot happening in this period. But if we're talking about, the 30s and 40s and then post-World War II, to me, it's one of my favorite periods. And I was so glad that Annette set this book during that time, because it's not a time period that many people, unfortunately, think about when they think about Native history. It's usually like in the way back, and this is pretty modern. And I love that piece of it. And there's a lot going on, even up to World War II with Indian reorganization under John Collier. Most people know about FDR and the New Deal. They're less familiar with the fact that there was an Indian New Deal under John Collier, and that phased out the boarding schools. My family and Cherokee Nation people out in Oklahoma were severely altered by the allotment policies. Those begin to be phased out. And he has a pretty mixed legacy, but there's just a lot going on in that period in terms of of policy and legal systems across what we refer to as Indian country. Just in terms of the Eastern Band, there's a lot to mention. I won't get to it all. Many people start leaving the reservations for work. They start doing things like the WPA programs. And I've heard even people in Snowbird, which is a Cherokee community over in Graham County, talk about their mothers and grandmothers going to work at like the TVA to build the Fontana Dam. Ecologically, you have the geography shifting with the chestnut blight and all the timbering. You have the rise of tourism for the Eastern Band, and just some dates to give some context. The creation of the Blue Ridge Parkway, Smoky Mountain National Park, 1934. Some of this leads to the rise of arts and crafts. So you have the Qualla Arts Co-op that's created 1946, Unto These Hills, 1950, the Oconaluftee Indian Village in 52. So tourism becomes huge. And I'll kind of end just by saying, on the horizon for Native people are two really problematic policies, and that's termination and relocation. So as I'm reading this book, I'm sort of thinking of all of these forces and then also what's coming. But I really appreciate the fact that it was in really a contemporary setting. I thought that was really cool.
Great, thank you for those comments and insights from you as well, Trey. So if we consider the themes, why are the themes of identity, heritage, and personal history important to the novel, Annette?
Thank you. Yeah, kind of to touch on what Trey has said, there is so much history, even just specifically if we're looking at the Eastern Band, that most people aren't aware of. And I think Trey kind of alluded to the fact that a lot of literature, especially in regards to Cherokee, is is from the removal period or prior to the removal period. I'm glad, that Trey identified it as contemporary. I kind of joke that when I was writing the novel, I didn't actually realize consciously that I was writing historical fiction until I was working on the marketing plan with the publisher, because everything felt so contemporary for me. And that just means the themes that you just mentioned, in terms of identity and heritage, and specifically like citizenship and belonging. I think about the book a lot in terms of what it has to say about how we label people. So even the title, Even As We Breathe, is a reference to the human spirit, and how really that should be how we determine our belonging on this earth, in my opinion. But throughout our history, we have focused so much on the temporary aspects of the body, right? That what our DNA says about us, or what our ancestry does, or what our skin color does, or a legal document does, even in terms of relationships beyond citizenship. So I really wanted to push back against that labeling that has happened all over the world, but specifically in the United States. And also the stereotypes that all Indian characters are in the distant past. And I think those two things are connected. When we talk about humanizing someone, we have to remove their culture and their community from a past, and move it into the present. And so I think all of the themes that are talked about in the book are really my way of confronting what has been in literature previously, and to educate in some way. I mean, I think, at least I feel as a Native writer, especially since this is the first novel from the Eastern Band, that I do have some educating that I have to do, even in fiction. I can't assume that everyone knows our history. We don't even know sometimes all of our history as citizens of our tribe. So it kind of has to go hand in hand with a fictional plot too. And I'm okay with that, again, because I'm a teacher. So I don't have a problem with that. And I think it's an opportunity to educate in a way that's accessible to a diverse readership.
That's great. And, as a native, we have to promote that continuous education and not assume that the narrative will remain true, accurate historically. So that's very important that was layered in. Trey, would you like to add any comments to or surrounding those themes of identity, heritage, and personal history
Well,
as
I
applies
did.
to the novel?
Well, I just there were a lot of things that stuck out to me that I really connect. It was a familiar novel, and I thought, like, the use of language, Lishi, names like Bud, like, it just was really familiar. And as a Native person, it's not a Cherokee person, it's just, you don't get that very often, or often enough, at least it seems. And so, for me, I just was thinking about what Annette was just saying in terms of citizenship, relationships, bodies. And to me, that always marks also a sense of place. And I think I've seen Annette talk about this in other places too, but Asheville is known as Tokiasti. It's Cherokee territory. And I teach at a university that's situated on these lands. And I feel the same obligation. It is a responsibility to educate, consistently. And I think I have questions for Annette that I want to ask her, but I'll save those.
Do save them.
I will.
Write them down if you have to, because we want to come back to that. So next, I want to ask you, Annette, how does the novel explore the intersection of class and race for the Cherokee, for the residents of Asheville, as well as the upper class foreign diplomats in the story?
Sure. So in the story, the foreign diplomats and foreign nationals are referred to as guests of the inn, and that's a little bit of PR work, right? But also a distinguishing factor from other prisoners who are held at other locations, like I mentioned, internment, for example, Japanese internment camps out west. It's not the same experience, and that was fascinating for me to kind of play with and to think about how in times of war, especially, social classes almost ebb and flow, right? There's no consistency in terms of who is treated a certain way. Is it based on race? Is it based on nationality? All kinds of factors, class. And so County, as our narrator, really gets to show us how everyone is searching for that element of personal power and personal agency within any given context. So even the men that County works with on the property, who are, for all intents and purposes, white men from the area who are working kind of maintenance level jobs, they're still seeking some sort of power foothold. And in the case of the novel, there are certain characters who see County almost as that stepping stone, right? Well, at least I'm not Indian, right? And yet you still have someone who's considered a prisoner who has rights and privileges that are greater than a free person, technically free person on the same land, on the same property. And I was glad that Trey connected it to land, because I think identity is always connected to place. So I think that was kind of the trick of the novel, was to think about how these labels, identities, class, and how everybody interacts is constantly changing. And simply because of human nature of trying to seek some kind of personal empowerment. And the tragedy of that is that we often seek it by by assuming we're better than somebody else, either because of our race or our class or some kind of other label. And so I wanted to explore that. I think one of the stories that came out of the book after the fact that has stuck with me in the last couple of years since the book has been out is a story a gentleman told me from Asheville. He's a historian from Asheville, and he was on an event, a virtual event I did with a group from Asheville. And afterward, he emailed me and told me that, and for those who have not read the book, there's a monkey in the book. That's important. And it would take us all night to talk about Edgar the monkey, but you should know there's a monkey. But anyway, the gentleman emailed me after the event, and he said, oddly enough, there was a storekeeper in Asheville during this time that had a monkey as a pet, and the local children would go down and kind of play with the monkey or see the monkey. But then they would go up to the Grove Park, and when the prisoners were out on the yard, the children would climb the fences and mock the prisoners acting like a monkey. And that, I didn't know that when I wrote the book, but it really was really, really telling about that time period and this, this bizarre setting to be at this opulent resort, who, is this place that is known for hosting the wealthiest people in the country, and all of a sudden now it's a prisoner. And then you have just all these different interactions of folks of all ages exerting this hierarchy, right? This kind of grapple for power within society.
If I may just offer an observation too, in terms of cultural identity and personal reflection for County, it seemed that he knew his place. That was one of the notes that I took as I was reading it, and I think that's interesting and telling of the time. However, he always had a sense of a comedic overtone, so I appreciated that. Thank you for those insights. And Trey, would you like to add anything to that conversation?
Well, I'll just
reflections.
I'll just say a couple of things. I mean, one, so I when I first started teaching at UNC Asheville, we lived up in Madison County, and the story I heard up there always was that at the Mountain Park Hotel in Hot Springs, they hosted German POWs. So when I heard about this book, I didn't obviously realize that at the same time they're hosting, prisoners of war at the Grove Park. Kind of interesting. But I think just, my reflection on that question really quickly is, in my work, I've been at UNC Asheville for 10 years, and I've worked with numerous Eastern Band students that have come to UNC Asheville, and we're primarily white institution. And so when I was reading the first part of this book, and I've heard some interview bits with Annette, to me, like, I've heard these similar stories and similar impressions from our students who are coming to school at places like UNC Asheville and other places. And that is hard for administrators and other folks to understand, how significant these issues of race and class play out when students first arrive. And it's not that far. I mean, we're only an hour from Cherokee. And there are, of course, a lot of similarities and a lot of spaces to build coalition, but it's still at times just totally overwhelming. And so when I'm reading that first part of the book and they're giving their impressions of Grove Park, it really struck a chord with me.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. And just as a reminder, if you have any questions during the conversation to our audience, feel free to enter those in the chat. I see we do have some of those populated now, and we'll get to those at the end of our discussion here. And next, I wanted to discuss what can we learn from this story regarding how we view our role in creating a more just and inclusive society.
When Trey was talking about the college students at UNCA, I was thinking about back to my experience as an undergraduate. And actually, Trey may have heard me talk about this before as well, but I remember walking in to the dean's office at Yale University, side by side with my best friend at the time, who's Lakota from Rosebud. And we had a meeting with the dean about a cultural event that we were having on campus, and we didn't have a major problem, but we had an obstacle we had to overcome, and so we had to go to the dean's office. And I remember we were about to walk in, and it's basically like you would think the dean's office at Yale would look like. It's a little overwhelming for anybody, but when we walked in, there's a huge fireplace, and above the fireplace was a portrait of Andrew Jackson. So, which you might see in some ways alluded to in the novel as well. But I remember looking over at my friend and saying, this isn't going to go well. And I think that's, it's those little messages you get when you enter into, a different cultural setting or a different social structure that may not even be intentional, but send different messages like that. And so, when I think about your question and, what can we learn from the story and how we create a more just society, I think that the story hopes to connect our histories as American. A lot of times World War II is seen as this nostalgic period in American history. We are all very proud of our role, in World War II for many reasons. But the story is a little bit more complex, and sometimes it's portrayed on the screen, or in books. And it cannot be separated from the history of Indian removal, for example. So even as we breathe talks about World War II service and World War I service for that matter, but it also talks about Indian removal in terms of Zadzi's recall of his family's history being placed in the stockades, right? All of that's intentional to tie us as Americans to our role in the world and on our own land, and the policies that Americans, have partaken in. And it's not a blame game in that way. I think what's important is to understand that every action is going to influence our future. And we just have to accept that, we have some history that has to be reckoned with before we can become, a better nation. And you can't cut pieces of our history out and focus on other pieces. And of course, Trey knows a lot more about the history and specific policy, but it's been said that Hitler studied federal Indian policy, and that informed, some of his actions. So, I think we can move forward by coming to terms with the reality of it, by not romanticizing Native peoples to the point of stereotypes or placing us directly in the past, but learning from the complexity of our communities and how we have been integral to the United States as a whole.
That's so good. Really continuing to tell that history, that historical perspective, and making sure that the true narrative is not lost through translation. And couldn't that be applied K-12 as well as through adults? Because we don't need to censor history, in my opinion. Trey, I'd love for you to weigh in on that same question. What can we learn from this story regarding our role in creating a more just and inclusive society?
Well, I think I don't really have much more to add than what both of y'all said. I 100% agree. I mean, I think for, you know, at least my role at UNC Asheville, I mean, I think it's a constant message of, you know, educating people that Native people are contemporary.
Mhm.
And that, you know, as tribal nations, we're also looking to the future. The future is not robbed of, you know, we're not robbed of the future either. And so I really can't say it much better than what y'all did. And I do think that, you know, my PhD is in curriculum and instruction, and I do think curriculum in public schools. I was a public school teacher for a long time. I mean, it's the front lines of these conversations. Um, and I do get asked about allyship a lot, and I don't, you know, I think these things are complex, and you know, some people. I think sometimes people want really um, black and white answers, and I don't think it always is that easy. I do think listening and observing is important, particularly if it regards native issues to native people.
Very good. So thank you. And also, we've got some other questions coming through and conversations. But before we get to that, Trey, I'd love to come back to some of those burning questions that you had for Annette as well.
Well, oh, sorry, um,
I know I
I,
distracted you by directing you to the chat. Sorry.
well, I just, so I teach an American Indian film class at that, and you know, when we talk about these films, and you know, I really, you know, I kind of break it up into modules, and the majority of films I show are, you know, we kind of start with Once Were Warriors, Coming Out of New Zealand, and then of course Smoke Signals. But you know, as you know, now you're looking at like Res Dogs on Hulu,
Hmm.
or Rutherford Falls on NBC. And I just was curious, you know, like you kind of talked about this, and I don't know if you want to talk much more about this, but just, I mean, even when it comes to like native art, you know, the struggle to be both an artist, you know, just simply an artist, and at the same time understanding the responsibility or feeling the responsibility of having to educate. And so I don't know that there's really, I don't know what I'm really asking other than I just would love to hear you, you know, talk a little bit more if possible. Like what is that like?
Yeah. No, yeah, it's something that I think about, you know, daily while I'm writing is that balance of, well, the old writing advice that everybody hears is show, don't tell, right? Like to be a good writer, show, don't tell. And I always find myself struggling with that a little bit when it comes to those important pieces of Native history that my reader would have to know. And I think I struggle with that because I want people to understand the irony of some of these situations, right? You know, specifically if we're talking about citizenship rights and it, I don't know how to put into words how ironic federal Indian policy is at times, but I want to explain that to a reader so they understand how that plays out in the scene later, maybe. But also, priority number one for me is that I can walk into Food Lion in Cherokee and face anybody there who has read, you know,
Yeah.
anything that I've written and not have to worry that they, you know, oh, you sold out or you use this stereotype or, you know, or that's not accurate in it. I won't do that. I won't, you know, I won't make that trade off. You know, they may not like something I've written, but, you know, I won't, you know, sell out anything that I'm teaching about our culture because a lot of people, you know, they want that romanticized narrative. They want the um, hyperbolic spirituality. They want some native character to talk to an animal, you know, and it talk back, something like that, right? But I know I cannot go into Food Line if I do that. So, but also I want to show people kind of the beauty and uniqueness of our community, and part of that is sense of humor. You know, we've kind of joked around already, and I want people to understand that that's who we are too, and I can show that more than have to just tell it, right? I can show that in how characters interact. So, yeah, I think it's a balance. And when I educate, it's just so it's so the audience gets the joke, right? They have to know some of the background, and I like it. It's a challenge. I like that some people see it maybe as a burden, but I think it makes our stories richer, and I think it makes our country and our world richer to share those stories.
I think it says so much about Native culture and how you brilliantly layered it through the character development. Knowing full well the weight of the culture, atrocities, and even of the current time, the fears, yet the comedic relief were just the lightness of joking, and that really came through. So I appreciate how that was evident from a cultural perspective and how you were able to weave that into the story. Trey, you have more questions, I believe, that you wanted to ask, or is that your last question you had? I thought you had a scroll.
Oh, Lorna, I have a bunch. I don't want to dominate. I mean, I can see people are asking questions in the Q&A and stuff.
So let's hop over there. We have Kara Stewart who asked you a question. Trey, do you mean termination in terms of Dr. Plecker during that time?
Yeah, I think you're talking about some of the racial codes and the classifications, and what I'm referring to is termination was an actual policy that sort of really begins to be bantered, discussed in the mid 1940s. Really takes hold in the 50s and goes through the 60s. Over 100 and some odd tribes are terminated. And Annette's kind of laughed, the irony of federal Indian law. This falls into this broad category of federal Indian law, particularly under congressional plenary power. And you can kind of get lost in all of this stuff. It's convoluted and complicated, but ultimately Congress, under plenary power wields a lot of authority. And I would say termination in some ways is a reaction against what I was referring to earlier in the 30s and early 40s in this reform era. But really the government, and I'm using the language at the time, was trying to get out of the Indian business. They were trying to rid themselves. And so one way to do that is to terminate tribal status. And they did that for over 100 tribes. The closest one to us is the Catawba in South Carolina. Did not get recognition back until the early 90s. I think that's right. So that's what I was referring to.
Yeah. And even the Lumbee tribe, for more than 100 years, we've sought federal recognition. We're the largest tribe east of the Mississippi. Yeah, we do have state recognition. So very interesting point there. There's another question in the chat from Cheryl Gant, who asks, share more about the reason you chose the title relating to the human spirit and or belonging on this earth.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to answer that question, but before I do, I didn't want to forget to kind of tag on to what Trey had said. That's another reason why I think the arts and literature is so important, because even going back to removal policy, you can see direct links from literature and the way that natives are captured in literature written by non-native people to the policy of removal. The language in some cases is the same. And so I think there's a direct tie between how literature represents a people and what can actually happen legally to that people based on their representation in like popular culture. If you think about literature as popular culture. So I wanted to make that point, that I think there's a direct correlation between the arts and legal status. But to the question about the title, So the book itself is really divided into three sections. When I think about it conceptually, it's bones, blood, and skin, which are three elements that often define identity for people, whether it be citizenship or community belonging, or family belonging. And kind of going back to how I started thinking about this novel, I had given myself a prompt to write as long as I possibly could about the simplest object I could think of. And I was in a small room in a library in Jackson County, ironically Jackson County, in the library there, which is actually a beautiful library. And I was writing on this prompt, and I decided to write about a clean bone. That was the simplest object I could think of. And so most of actually what's in the prologue of the novel came from that experience, that writing prompt. And as I thought about what I had written that day, I was reminded, about what do we leave behind and what matters about what we left behind. And that kind of just went off in all kinds of directions, because I used to work for one of our principal chiefs, and I had an office right next to his, which is really dangerous for a writer, to have an office next to a political official's office, because you can hear everything. Don't tell him I said that, Trey. And I just remember a meeting he had, and I'll paraphrase, but he did, somebody was talking about using some land for a venture in a neighboring county, and it would require unearthing Cherokee graves. And I remember the chief saying, "Let me explain it to you this way. How would you feel if I went up to the cemetery and dug up your grandmother?" And it was just silence at that point. But that was the first time I'd heard it put so simply, that bones for this visitor were artifacts, like a museum, right? They could be moved. But for our chief representing our tribe, they were human. They were a reminder of who we are as human beings. And so I really thought about what is the most important thing that we leave behind, and what do those bones symbolize beyond kind of their physicality, right? And how should we be determining our relationships with people? It really should be based on our human spirit, and how we relate in that way. So in the novel, there are different references, religious and non-religious references to the breath of life, for example. And actually in the original novel, in the original manuscript, that line, "even as we breathe," was part of the original manuscript. And my editor and I removed it after a lengthy discussion. But I kind of like that it's not actually a line in the book, because I always get asked about the title, and it gives me the opportunity to really talk about those different motifs of bone, blood, and skin that come up in the novel as well.
I love that. Thank you. There is a question also that was in the chat, not in the Q&A section, from Jerry Edwards. What is Decoration Day in the book?
Yeah. So Decoration Day is a day in our community, and Trey, feel free to jump in on this if you want, where graves are decorated at local cemeteries. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know if that is just Appalachia or how far out that kind of tradition occurs. But one of the reasons I included it is I had one time I did a article for Smoky Mountain Living magazine about a cemetery in Swain County that's fascinating because it has, and I apologize, I don't remember the dates to which these graves go back, but the graves had, the cemetery has Cherokee graves, graves of whites from the area, and graves from African Americans from the area, and they're all separate sections of the cemetery. And there was this, for years, this unspoken understanding on Decoration Day, that different groups would go at different times of the day to decorate the graves in this, shared cemetery. And that's just fascinating to me, and how that's changed, of course, over time. But yeah, I don't think Decoration Day is just a Cherokee thing. I know it's in Appalachia in general, but I don't know how widespread it is. But it's kind of this day to remember ancestors, and go and put flowers. I should say, put flowers on graves in particular.
Very well. And I'm going to turn to the North Carolina Humanities staff, Caitlin and Melissa. If there are other questions, either in the chat or the Q&A, would you please share those now? I know we have two.
I can read that for you, Lorna. So we had a question from Jenny related to the book. Why wouldn't Bud acknowledge his son?
I don't want to give any spoilers, so I'm going to be careful how I answer this question. I think Bud is living with a tremendous amount of guilt and feeling of inadequacy. And I don't think, I have to be so careful how I say this. I don't, some people really don't like Bud, and I understand that. Bud has many faults. But there's also a part of Bud that doesn't want to tarnish the memory of other characters in the book, and doesn't want to cause more trouble than he's caused maybe in the past. And again, labels are a fluid thing in the book, and so Bud is trying to act as a father in the only way he knows how, even if he just doesn't call himself that. And so I think he in so many ways is scared to do that. Yes. Okay. I'm trying to get out of this question without spoilers. Yeah.
Good job doing that. I think we have two more. Caitlin?
Yeah, our next question is from Christine, and she opened by saying if you realize how much of an impact a novel has had opening up the minds of people who maybe were not exposed to this kind of deep history and learning about Native perspectives from Native peoples. She said that she was a child military officer, and so she had moved around a lot and trying to kind of think about these different stories in different states. She was surprised and didn't really know anything about the history of Andrew Jackson. So her question was more around, how do we address these issues and making sure we keep history relevant? Obviously, we don't have a national curriculum, but how do we make sure history is relevant and meaningful when we're talking about teaching?
I'll give that to Trey. That's right up his alley.
Thanks, Annette. Yeah, I mean, that's an awesome question. And I don't know that I necessarily have an answer. I can tell you that I'm really interested in place-based education, and all three of those areas, California, Hawaii, and Virginia, all have Native people in it. And I had a similar experience to Annette one time. I was invited to do a talk, and they put me up at a bed and breakfast, and I got there at night, and I didn't even get to check the place out. And then when I got up the next morning, I was coming downstairs, and the entire wall was the largest Andrew Jackson portrait I'd ever seen. It was just like, what?
But did you sleep well?
I slept good, but I didn't sleep good the night after. But I think, you don't have to look far in contemporary politics to understand, um, the battleground that is curriculum. And I just, as a teacher, I believe this. I went into teacher education. I believe you have to teach fearlessly and you have to teach truthfully, and that's all you can do. Um, and I think the historical record is what the historical record is, and the truth is there in all of those places you mentioned. And so, no, we don't have a national curriculum, but all of these local places, one, I would tell you there's indigenous history right there. And two, I don't know the local politics, but I do think that we have, as a teacher, a responsibility to teach truthfully.
And Trey and I have also talked about, the real need for curriculum that can be taught at different levels, because, the history of Native peoples in this country is complex, and the material available, the history available on it is very academic, level writing, college level. And we've had some conversations about how we can make that more accessible at different levels of education. So, because I owe Trey a call back on this, by the way.
So Trey, if I could tag on to that, I have a
Sure.
follow-up question to the comment that you just made. So what responsibility, in your opinion, do we as natives and as educators bear to, maybe not the best term, but sugarcoat history? So in order to make it palatable, or is that just not a responsibility that we should have to bear?
Well, that's an awesome question. I mean, I'm a social studies teacher, and one of the things we talk about in our discipline is trying to facilitate empathy.
Mm.
And I do think that can be romanticized a little bit. I think that's a challenge. But I think that's why I include the word fearless with truthful. I mean, you to be a teacher on the front lines, I feel you have to have courage.
Yes.
I don't feel any responsibility, but I also have the privilege of being at a university. I don't know if I would answer this the same way when I was a public school teacher. Annette is a current public school teacher. I don't feel a responsibility to protect people's feelings. That's not my job. My job is to stay honest, and to be accurate, and I think as a social studies teacher, you have at your disposal, I mean, you have the voices of people at the time. You don't have to make it up. The people spoke at those times. Native people were resisting and speaking, and so primary and secondary sources. But that's my social studies spiel. If that answers anywhere close to your question.
It does. Thank you for that, because the responsibility is already so huge just to deliver the historical perspective truthfully and fearfully. In order to layer that on with making it more palatable with a sugar coat makes it even more burdensome. But it is an honor. Susan Thomas has a question. Caitlin, would you share that?
Yeah, Susan asked, how did you decide to tell the story from County's perspective?
I decided to tell from County's perspective. I think one of the biggest influences on choosing the voice for the novel, and I was really, really focused on finding the right voice for the novel. One of the biggest influences was Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, his memoir written to his son. It's a book that I teach to my seniors every year. And I remember the first time I read that book and how impactful it was, how that voice was impactful. And I really, as a writer, then I start trying to break down, well, why is that voice so impactful? And it is memoir, so that narrator makes sense for a memoir. But the fact that he was writing to his son and created that audience for the reader really influenced the kind of first person voice, speaking to a direct audience that I wanted to capture. Additionally, I had to think about you know, was this going to be the retrospective novel that it ended up being? You know, you want to be in the action as much as possible, and so it's a bit of a risk to kind of be telling the story, you know, from the future backward. But one of the main reasons I did that is I wanted to present a Cherokee character who was articulate, was obviously educated and reflective. And I knew that if I told the story 100% in the present from a 19-year-old's perspective, I'd have to use the language of a 19-year-old. And I didn't want that to be confused with, you know, this character who's an uneducated Native person, right? Just adding to the long list of Native characters who, you know, spoken broken English and things like that. I wanted to provide, you know, a new character to literature who spoke eloquently at times, and who was reflective about growth and things like that. So that's why I chose that retrospective point of view. And then again, you know, a lot of people ask me why I chose a male character, right? Being a female. And I knew I needed someone who was willing to take the risks, who was a little unsure of himself or themselves. And I just kept hearing the voices of my students. I kept hearing the voices of the young men that I went to school with and grew up with, who were smart, who had so much potential, but had obstacles that were completely out of their control, that changed, you know, their paths. And I wanted to give voice to that. Not long after the book came out, I found out that a man that I had gone to school with, one of my friends from childhood, who reminds me so much of County, he was a smart guy, but just really didn't have the opportunities. I found out that he'd been found dead, and the circumstances surrounding his death were kind of unknown. And I just, you know, I wanted to provide a narrator who gave voice to that part of our community that I think doesn't always get a voice.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing the insights. And for those maybe who have not finished reading the book, now that layers on to your perception as you read. So technically we're out of time, but if I could share the one last question, whatever happened to Edgar the monkey? And that is from Gary Edwards.
Oh, I love Edgar so much. Whatever happened to Edgar is what you want to have happen to Edgar. And I think that most readers are like me, and that Edgar is immortal, and I hear him periodically in the woods. But that's open to interpretation, and that's purposeful.
Wonderful. Well, that's all for questions, but as we wrap up, would you like to share anything else about this project or future projects that either of you have going on?
Well, I am writing another novel. It's not a sequel. I've been asked if there's a sequel. But my current project, I won't go into too much detail, but is contemporary, set contemporary and in Cherokee, and it has a female protagonist. So I just did a complete 180. But I'm really excited about it, and kind of exploring Cherokee values that are embedded in some of our traditional stories, and what happens with the different interpretations of those stories. And that's about all I'll say about it, except that because it's contemporary and set in Cherokee and deals with politics, that I may not be around too long, Trey. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see who reads it. But also, I always want to mention that I'm working with the Appalachian Futures series through University Press of Kentucky, which gives voice and publication to a diverse array of authors that make up Appalachia. And so, we're continually looking for folks, specifically for me, of course, folks with Native backgrounds in Appalachia or ties to Appalachia. It's pretty broad, but also people that represent all the diversity of Appalachia. And so part of that series, a personal project for me, is working on an anthology of Native literature from Appalachia, which is so tricky. But I'm looking forward to diving into that, and also getting back with Trey about what we talked about at the beginning of the school year about maybe some curriculum, right, Trey?
That's right.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing your insights into your inspiration, as well as some of the character insights and the plot lines that you intended to come through that maybe we missed. And we look forward to the next adventure ride with you. Trey, tell us what's happening in your area of North Carolina and what's next for you.
Well, I just want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Lorna, thank you so much for moderating. It's really been nice to meet you and to work with you. And Annette,
Same here.
What an honor to be with you, Annette, and to talk about this book. I really loved it and I appreciate it. And to the Humanities Council for putting this together. I really appreciate it. So that's really how I wanted to end. The only thing I would say, is I am the executive director for the Center for Native Health and really passionate about that project. We're a small 501(c)(3). And so check us out on the web, centerfornativehealth.org.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Look forward to hearing and reading more of you and your work at this time. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We appreciate the engagement and the questions that you offered. Stay tuned for next projects. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Lorna, and thank you to Annette and Trey for their conversation, and to you, Lorna, for your excellent moderation skills and those wonderful probing questions. We learned so much this evening. At the conclusion of this event, those of you who registered with an email address will receive a brief survey to complete, and we would greatly appreciate you completing this survey to hear your feedback on this program. We encourage you to visit our website at www.nchumanities.org to learn more about other upcoming events in the North Carolina Read series and to subscribe to our email newsletter to stay up to date with all NC Humanities news and programs. Our next virtual event will be on May 11th and will be on the book Polly Murray, A Personal and Political Life by Troy Saxby. And we also have information about our June event for Driving with the Devil by Neil Thompson. So those are both available on our websites, and we hope to see you at future events. Thank you again, everyone, for attending and for all of the wonderful questions that you gave in the chat and the Q&A. And we hope that everyone has a great evening.